to talk about it.
Sure.
And there were lots of times over the, that 10-year period of time where I felt like, well, that ain't right. And, I've got a story to tell, part of that,
Yeah.
And then I would, something would happen, and then I would change my mood or something, and I would, give a crap. I'm gonna talk about this anymore. And then something would happen, and it would come up again, and part of it is I've learned now not to get off the subject, but you stow it. You package it up, compartmentalize it, and you put it away,
Right.
and you move on with your life. And then somebody like Randy or this gal in Pennsylvania calls you up, or Charles, or whoever, and then it comes up again.
Right.
And you go back there, and there was a period of time when I was younger that it wasn't super comfortable, and then there was sort of a middle period where all I really wanted to do was process it and talk about it with people that were interested in listening to it. And of course my wife is sick and tired of it. Doesn't want to hear any more about it.
Yeah.
And then now it's getting to the point where I'm getting close to being done, and I can't remember stuff, and that's and then you end up going back to that sort of trauma and grief, which I think I processed enough of it. So this may be the last interview I ever do about this.
Yeah.
And I don't. It doesn't have to happen in one sitting or whatnot. If you.
Sure.
But so this is what I realized after reading Charles' book, that and I just read the part that I was involved in. I never bothered with the rest of it because I was kind of put off initially because there were things that my wife read it and she said, "You didn't say that," and she was sitting right there.
Right.
So anyway,
Yeah.
then I became a little more careful about what. I mean, it was a learning experience, and I understand Charles needs to be published, and I mean it's his job. It's how he makes a living, how he feeds his family, and I get that. That was my argument to Kurt. Is we gotta show up on time to these radio interviews. We can't be completely drunk or stoned or whatever. We have to be coherent. It's a business, and that's where he and I were in constant conflict all the time. Is because he was just interested in expressing his art, or I later understood that he as a creative, he was basically exercising his demons and vomiting up his pain and his trauma and his issues about his life, and then he would just move on to the very next thing, and that's the way he wrote, and was just, and had so much grief and anger about his mom and his dad's divorce and the situation his mom was in and all that other stuff.
Sure. Let's pause for just a second, just because I think you're recording, right?
Yeah, I just turned them on.
Okay, so for the record, it's March 18th, 2024,
Okay.
and we're talking with Ryan Egner?
Mhm.
Okay.
That's correct.
All right. That's really interesting what you're talking about, because over the years, part of what I've read from Kurt is that lyrics were always secondary.
Absolutely.
And he said, well, it doesn't mean anything. And I almost feel like he was trying to say, don't read too much into the lyrics.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, there's, like what you're saying, it's if he's drawing from his personal experiences,
Well,
it seems very raw,
It was, and this is the thing. It's like I don't know if you've ever read. Like there was a book that came out that was his handwriting of his journals.
I have.
And those, I mean, if there was ever whatever you call that Jack Kerouac style of writing, that's exactly the way Kurt wrote. And I had those different notebooks in my hand, and he would show them to me. He wasn't embarrassed about it at all.
Okay.
And read through them. It was very reflexive. He was just, letting his mind be free and bright. At that time, I didn't see it that way. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know anything about William S. Burroughs or Jack Kerouac or any of the beat writers. I mean, Kurt probably was well aware of those sorts of things.
Oh, sure.
But
I understand he spent a good amount of time at the library.
Well, that's all they had to do.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. People come up and ask me, like, oh, he was so gifted. Yeah, that one thing. If anybody did one thing, not bathe, not brush his teeth, not eat, not dress, not care about any other aspect of life, just do that one thing, you get kind of good at it eventually.
Sure.
Or you disappear into obscurity. But he was accomplished, and he was gifted. I'm not taking that away, but he was very focused on that one thing. And
so he was pretty driven, is what seems apparent. Driven to do this form of art through music.
Well, you got to realize, Chuck, that like there was no, the idea that he was ever going to become successful was a farce. And even when I suggested, well, I remember one time when I was over one of the very earliest rehearsals he ever had, and Chris was there, and Aaron was there, and I was there, and Kurt, and they got done playing, and he asked me what I thought about him, and I was completely blown away by the music, and was like, this could be on the radio. I could hear this on KGHO. And
do you recall where this took place at?
Yeah, it was at that little house on
1,000 and a half.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
that's
shack.
Yeah, and that's where he lived with Matt Lukin. And
Aaron said that he lived there for a while too. Can you verify that?
No, I thought he lived down in some apartments, not far from there.
Yeah.
But not there.
Okay.
I don't. There were. I mean, he might have spent the night there or something. But
Sure.
Anyway, when I said that about commercial success or mass appeal or something like that, or radio acceptability, it was like I was insulting him. It was like a joke. It was like, you're not being serious. This isn't, that's not, don't stop it. And
Was he being humble, or was he thinking that it's not attainable?
So the idea, what later became, the breakthrough, in my mind anyway, to the level that they achieved, had never ever happened before. And I realized that there was kind of music that Kurt was obviously into, and that was the other thing. The only reason I was there was because I was trying to get something out of these musicians. So I was learning. and so we were discussing all these things about music, and particularly about underground and punk rock, and which I knew nothing about. And so I sort of like hung on every word that Matt Lukin and Buzz Osborne and Mike Dillard and Chris Novoselic and Kurt Cobain and Shelley Dilley and all, because they had, I mean, some of them it was months or years, and some of it was people had been involved with it for several years, and, like Buzz.
Sure.
But I had come from more mainstream music, more just 70s rock and roll stuff, which I mean, he thought was fine, but not what he thought he wanted. He was mechanically capable of creating, and he wasn't sure that it was what he wanted to do artistically. And mostly, this bit about wanting to become part of the Melvins was absolutely true. And not only because even in like 1985 or 86, Buzz was already an enigma, and the Melvins were already enigma. They were the like high mark from a professional point of view, from an artistic point of view. They were very focused, very, they were getting shows, playing all the time, which, I mean, that's all we wanted, that's all Kurt ever wanted to do, was be what the Melvins were doing. They were far enough out there that no one knew what to make of them, but they got the respect. And no one, I mean, you didn't really look at the early Melvins and go, wow, that's genius. It is, but the main thing you're not saying is it doesn't suck. I don't know what it is. I'm not sure if it's good, but I know it doesn't suck. And that's all Kurt really wanted to be. But what he was doing, he thought was a lot more bubblegum and wouldn't be respected by Buzz. And so that was sort of who he was. He was the high priest that he was trying to please.
Interesting.
And so I think there was a part of him that when he wrote About a Girl, he was like, Buzz is going to hate this. It wasn't what I thought or what Chris thought. I mean, maybe it's what Chris thought, but it was, secondary to what Buzz was going to think.
Interesting.
And how, even though that was really probably the breakthrough song, and even I sort of rejected it initially because he went through a phase where he was like studying John Fogerty's work with CCR, and I thought, I mean, this is what I saw him do, was he would analyze something and then write a song, which is exactly what he tried to teach me. Is when I was trying to learn guitar, he was one of the very first people to sit down and say, show me a guitar lick that you have in one of your songs, and then he would say, that's a song. And it was like 3 notes put together, and I thought it was just like something I could figure out how to do with my fingers, and over and over and over again. I said, no, that's a song. That is a whole song. Oh, now it just has to be arranged. And that was like, really? And so anyway, that's the way that I got along with Kurt. Kurt was very supportive, and so it made me want to hang around him more, and where Buzz was very sarcastic and witty and clever, and I just didn't feel like I could even compete in that. Those speed of those conversations and the snarky comments and all that. I mean, things would, that was an insult, wasn't it?
Did you spend much time at Dale Crover's house where they would rehearse? I know
Mhm.
that Kurt mentions that he spent hundreds of, rehearsals, watching them.
They rehearsed every single day.
every day.
And I don't, and sometimes probably twice a day.
Wow.
And I mean, that was the other thing, is it was just a place where you could dependably find them. I mean, that was the other thing, is like, there was no money, so it's not like you could drink yourself to death or smoke yourself to death. There was just nothing to do. But once you got a guitar and an amplifier, you could sit in a room for days and days and days, and then you could probably get $5 and put, 10 gallons of gas in a car and drive somewhere and perform in front of somebody, and maybe get another $5 to do it all over again. And in, the mid 1980s, that was like, we weren't into sports, we weren't killing it with the ladies, or, socially we were the outcasts of the entire harbor. So we hung out together. And Dale Crover's house was a dependable hotspot, because if they weren't there, then they must be playing somewhere in Tacoma or Olympia, or, up at Guerrilla Gardens in Seattle, or wherever.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk timeline. I'd kind of like to go through, if this works for you, in kind of a linear fashion, and go back to, if you can recall, did you meet Kurt or Chris first?
Well, so Chris and I had known each other for a lot longer than Kurt. I met Chris first, and actually his brother Robert and I were in a band together.
What was the name of the band?
We didn't even get that far. We just had a couple of rehearsals up at his house. Literally, I was 14, 15 years old. I had a guitar and an amplifier, and my buddy Brett Walker had a drum kit, and we got on a East County transit bus, rode it to town, got off at the bottom of Thinkamy Hill, and humped the gear up the hill to Chris's house.
Up on Fairfield.
Yeah, and that's where, and I knew Chris already, but Robert was the one that I was interested in playing with, and would agreed to try to start a band or whatever.
So are you closer to Robert's age then, and would have gone to school or had classes with him at this point?
No, Chris and I were the same age.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And at that point, when you started playing with Robert and forming this group, was Chris involved in anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, so Chris was already hanging out with the Melvins as far as I can remember, but I mean, that event, do you know about the Love Buzz Big Cheese single?
Yes.
So on that single, on the original, there's an inscription right around the label. You know what it says?
No.
It says, "Why don't you sell those guitars and buy shovels?" Now that has nothing to do with Nirvana. That happened at one of these rehearsals that I had with Robert and Brett Walker at Chris Novoselic's house.
Okay.
And so we get up there, and we're in the bedroom. The two boys were sharing a bedroom. Chris wasn't there, so it was Robert and Brett and I, and we set up all the gear and we're trying to play, and Chris came home. And so he comes in, and that's really where Chris and I first talked about music and stuff, and I found out that he is quite well educated, and I mean way more than I was, and he started talking about B.B. King and different things, and was showing me different licks on guitar and whatnot. And about that time, it must have been 5 or 5:30 or something like that. The boy's dad came home, Christoph, and they both seemed to be kind of concerned about that. And he came up the stairs, stomp, 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 and pushed in the door. And Chris is, big guy then, at that age even. And so he was just telling his dad to, it's fine, we're just in here, a couple of friends came over, and they're just trying to play music, that's all. And he was upset, and he was confrontational. You know, he's Croatian, European, and he's like, "Who are you? What's your name?" And scared the crap out of both Brett and I, and embarrassed Chris and Robert completely. And anyway, Chris is saying, "Dad, you know, it'll be fine. Just leave us alone, and they'll leave here in a little bit." And he looked at all of us and he says, "Why don't you guys sell those goddamn guitars and buy shovels and do something useful?" And that was it.
Oh, wow.
And he left. So it had nothing to do with this Nirvana band, but all these years later, it became, you know, a thing where they would, you know, it was a story.
Yeah.
And then when they first, I mean, that single was like the very first, but the most, like the highest level of success they ever expected.
Sure.
You know, that first single. So they, you know, utilized it for that quote on that record.
Oh,
You know.
that's a great story.
Yeah. And it's not in the books.
Yeah, I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it has nothing to do with Nirvana, but it has everything to do with Nirvana.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it has to. And I think it has a lot to do with probably the mindset of probably the adults in the room at that time on the harbor.
Well, yes, it's. I mean, very working class.
Yes.
And exactly. I mean, it's still kind of today. I mean, I don't know about today. I guess, you know, like when I got married in the late 80s and early 90s, it was still kind of a thing with the working class, and whether or not music was a specific way for a young person to be successful, you know. And so, you know, you always want your sons or daughters to do whatever to be the best, and you don't go, "Oh, you should follow your dreams," especially if you're a working class immigrant,
Yeah.
you know, family.
Very practical approach.
Yes,
to
I
life.
mean, you
Yeah.
learn a skill that you
Yeah.
can always fall back on.
Yeah.
And that was the message my dad gave me and my mom gave me.
Sure.
And that's exactly what Christoph was trying to tell his sons.
So, when this was taking place, and this was relatively early on with knowing Chris and Robert, this would be about when would you say, around 85?
82,
82, oh, that early.
83,
Okay.
around that time.
Okay.
82, 83,
Yeah.
82 maybe.
Okay.
So even before the Melvins were like officially
Yeah.
even happening, because also right around that time is when I saw the Melvins' first performance at Thriftway and at Guller's down on the, there was a thing called the Unboat River Float, and it was the precursor to Metal Church with Mike Murphy singing. Shrapnel played, and the Melvins opened, and then back in a year later after that, maybe, or maybe it was that same year, the Melvins opened again for Metal Church when Mike was out of the band and Dave Wayne was in the band, and they played the show at the DNR Theater.
Oh, okay. So,
And I was with Rogues Gallery at that time.
okay.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought that up. So the DNR show, where the Melvins opened for Metal Church, I've read this a couple different ways, and one of the stories, or maybe more than one of the stories, says that it was a satellite project of the Melvins billed under the Stiff Woodies. And for the final song, Chris comes out on stage. I believe he's playing guitar and singing.
Yeah, so I don't know about the Stiff Woodies and that whole thing, because I mean that was before I was formally introduced to really any of them.
Okay.
Like I said, I knew Chris's brother. I knew Chris, that's who he is, but we weren't like friends really. I was friends with his younger brother at that time.
Yes.
And I had been working with Black Ice. We were doing this, you know, basically a cover band, but very much heavy metal, Judas Priest, Rush, that kind of thing, Van Halen. And so when they played the show with Metal Church, and I didn't really know anything about Metal Church or what Shrapnel was all about, it was like sort of the next level of they were all moving into this originals kind of thing, and so with Rogues Gallery was playing, still continuing at the covers, and so when I saw the Melvins playing, they were playing really fast, like early Black Flag style.
Okay.
And Mike Dillard was on drums, and I don't even know what they did. It was just like one big run-on song, and it was, you know, and I didn't have a palette for that style yet, and so it was just like a huge wall of sound, and I saw what they were doing, and it sounded amazing. But when Chris came out, the very last song, and they played Sunshine for Your Love by Cream, they played it really fast, and Chris did sing, and I don't know, you know, I don't know that there was much talk about it from what I remember. He just came out, plugged in, and off they went, and it was incredible. I knew what they were doing. It became a song that I was interested in learning because of that night, and then years later, and then Rogues Gallery was on, and then Metal Church was on, and that was it. And so between, you know, the Thriftway show, the Gullers Unboat River Float show, which I don't even know the date of that one, and then the DNR theater show. I mean, it could have been the same year, all in 6 months time, or a week's time, for all I know. It's that the precision on that is beyond me at this stage of the game.
But you do know that when Chris performs with the Melvins for this final song at the DNR, this is still pre
Kroger.
Kurt and Chris playing together.
Absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I don't, and that's stuff that happened with Fecal Matter and the Stiff Woodies and all that stuff. That's the stuff of legends when I was in Phoenix. So I left in 1984, like December, last half of December of '84. I left and didn't come back until '86.
Oh, okay.
And so all that happened during that period of time when I was gone, except Chris moved to Phoenix and stayed with me.
Right, yeah.
And that's when we really became friends and started the longer conversation about music, and where he got involved with teaching me how to play guitar and whatnot.
Shelley came along too.
Yeah.
To Phoenix.
Yeah. And looking, you know, with hindsight, I look back at it and go, oh, I see. Shelley and I were actually better friends. She was more interested in having a devotional relationship than Chris or Kurt. You know, they were looking, you know, still the competitive, like, what can I get out of you? What can I get out of you? What can I get out of you? You know, and that was.
Did you meet Shelley first, or?
I think we had some friends, mutual friends. That's how we all, you know, again, we were all sort of the outcasts of the harbor, which there weren't a lot. Everybody was sort of still trying to fit in very desperately. You were either an academic or an athletic superstar or a socialite, and we didn't qualify for any of those. And so it was just really not.